Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
At my daughter's graduation celebration, as the auditorium filled with applause and the proud chatter of families who had scraped, saved, and sacrificed to get their children here, I sat at the edge of my chair, fighting a mixture of exhaustion and pride that came from years of pushing through when quitting would have been so much easier. I had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple dress that didn't call attention to me but felt respectable enough for the occasion, and as I sat among the rows of parents, I kept waiting for the moment when she would spot me and give me that small nod of acknowledgement children sometimes reserve for their mothers, the silent recognition that says, "I see you, I know you've been here all along." Instead, when her name was called and the spotlight caught her smile, she strode across the stage with the confidence of someone who believed she had built her success entirely on her own. After the ceremony, surrounded by friends and relatives, she walked up to me, her diploma in hand, and with a voice that carried far enough for everyone nearby to hear, she looked me in the eye and said, "You don't deserve a seat here. You did nothing for me." There was a hush that followed her words, as though the very air had been pulled out of the room, and I could feel people shifting uncomfortably, waiting for me to either break down or lash out. But I simply smiled, clapped my hands together as if I were applauding her performance, and swallowed the sharp sting in my throat. I don't know if you've ever had the kind of moment where years of sacrifice dissolve into dust in front of you, where every late-night shift, every bill you paid by cutting into your own needs, every tear you shed in private so your child wouldn't see your weakness, all of it gets erased with one cruel sentence. I had it right then, standing in a banquet hall filled with the smell of catered food I had no appetite for, while people's eyes darted between us like they were watching the climax of some sordid soap opera. My ex-husband was there too, of course, standing smug in the corner, the kind of man who had always been more interested in being admired than being responsible. He gave me a look, half pity and half gloat, as if to say, "Well, what did you expect?" I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I let the humiliation wash over me, and I gave her a smile so controlled that it might have looked genuine to anyone who didn't know the storm brewing behind my ribs. That's the thing about being underestimated. People assume silence equals surrender, when in reality, silence is often the moment just before the strike. As the evening carried on, I excused myself early, claiming fatigue, which wasn't even a lie. I was tired down to the bone, tired of being invisible, tired of being taken for granted, tired of being told I had given nothing when, in reality, I had given everything. I went home, changed out of my dress, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt beans and memory. And that was when I remembered something she must have assumed I'd forgotten: the account. See, years back, when she was still in high school and full of plans about out-of-state universities, I'd opened a college account in her name. At first, it was a simple arrangement, meant to help manage scholarship deposits and some of the money I tucked away from the jobs I worked quietly. Over time, as tuition bills got bigger and financial aid covered less than promised, that account became the main artery keeping her afloat. She probably never even wondered where half those deposits came from, never stopped to consider that the woman she dismissed as irrelevant was the one who made sure late fees never strangled her progress. That night, though, as my phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from distant relatives who hadn't seen the full spectacle of my daughter's performance, I logged in. The balance stared back at me, the product of years of scraping together money from overtime hours, cutting back on everything from new shoes to doctor visits for myself, all so she would never feel the sharp edge of lack. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, not in hesitation but in contemplation, because I knew what I was about to do would not just sting, it would shift the ground beneath her feet. By the time I shut my laptop, the account was empty, the money tucked away into a place where she would never reach it without going through me. And in its place, I left a single note, brief enough to be impossible to misinterpret: "Earn it." I sat back, breathing in the silence of my kitchen, hearing only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of my daughter's words from earlier. I knew the morning would bring fire. I knew the phone would not stop ringing, the accusations would rain down, and the carefully curated image my daughter had built of herself as entirely self-made would start to crack. But for the first time in years, I felt something different. Not peace, not triumph, but a sharp, cold clarity that comes only when you've been pushed so far into a corner that the only way out is forward, claws bared. Morning came with sunlight that felt harsher than usual, flooding through the blinds as my phone lit up with call after call, her name flashing, her friends' numbers appearing, relatives piling on with messages of outrage. I didn't answer. I let it ring, each vibration against the table a drumbeat of the storm to come, and I sipped my coffee slowly, almost savoring the anticipation. The world thought I had done nothing. By the time I was finished, they would know just how much I had done and how much I was still capable of doing. The first round of calls came from my daughter, whose contact name I had never changed from the nickname she picked in middle school. A small sentimental mistake that suddenly looked ridiculous on the screen as it flashed again and again while I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing a mug that did not need rinsing, letting the water run longer than necessary just to give myself the kind of pause that mothers are never afforded, and when I finally set the mug upside down on the drying rack I allowed myself one glance at the lock screen, not to read the messages, those would be waiting like stacked dishes, but to feel the weight of her outrage pressing from a distance like weather rolling in over a field. I did not pick up, not because I enjoyed the cruelty of silence, but because there are moments when explanation feeds a fire, and what I needed most was for the flames to consume the dead wood that had accumulated between us. All the assumptions and borrowed narratives and secondhand judgments that had made her so comfortable announcing to a crowded room that I had done nothing for her, when the truth was that I had done so much quietly that it had started to look like nothing. By mid-morning the calls shape-shifted into a chorus of relatives who appointed themselves mediators as if the family tree had suddenly sprouted a grievance committee. And every one of them opened with a version of the same sentence about love and forgiveness before shifting into a lecture on generosity and how a decent mother would never jeopardize her child's future. And I listened to a few of them through to the end with the phone on speaker while I sorted receipts from a shoebox that still smelled like the sneakers I could not afford to buy 2 summers ago. Remembering how many of these thin, crumpled slips of paper were proof of tuition deposits and book purchases and dentist visits, and that strange dorm fee that sounded like a prank but posted as a charge anyway. And the longer I let their voices drone, the clearer I heard my own breathing, steady and unapologetic. My ex-husband finally called near noon with the performative gravity of a man who likes to rehearse his lines, telling me this was not just petty but destructive, that I had humiliated our daughter on the biggest day of her life. And when I asked him softly whether he remembered the night she called to say the bursar had flagged a past due balance, and he promised to send something and did not, he pivoted so quickly into an accusation about my coldness that I had to smile. Because coldness is what people call boundaries when they have lived too long in the warmth of your unpaid labor. I let him talk until his voice began to fray. Then I ended the call without a scene, and afterward I sat with my back against the kitchen cabinet and closed my eyes long enough to let the reel of our history play its usual highlights. The arguments about money that always ended with me covering the difference. The holidays where he brought laughter and I brought casserole dishes and a stack of bills to pay later. The night I took a third shift and pretended I wanted it because the idea of telling the truth, namely that there was no choice, made me feel like I had failed at being the kind of mother television shows insist exists in every zip code. What had I failed at, really, other than the performance of ease? By early afternoon the calls slowed, replaced by a string of messages from my daughter that bounced between fury and injured dignity, and somewhere in the middle of the long scroll, she wrote a sentence that told me everything I needed to know about the story she believed. You have no right to touch my funds, which would have been persuasive if the deposits had been hers, if the scholarships had covered what the brochures promised, if the boyfriend with the talk show charisma and the recycled business ideas had not spent a semester siphoning from that account in the name of an app that was supposed to disrupt something as ordinary as grocery lists. And the bank records I had read late at night with a throbbing temple made me a witness to transactions she perhaps barely noticed, because when you are very young and the water in the sink runs freely you assume there is a river behind the wall. I did not write back to correct her, not yet, because truth delivered too early becomes noise. And I wanted her to hear it. So I drove to the branch where the account had been opened, the same bland building where a personal banker once called me dear, and handed over a lollipop as if sugar could sweeten the bitter taste of those minimum balances. And I asked for printed statements and a notarized letter confirming custodial authority that should never have been in question, but always is when a woman asserts control in a space where she was expected to sign and smile. And as I waited for the clerk to return from the humming printer, I remembered the braces that embarrassed her in ninth grade and the way I had counted singles in the parking lot of a second job so the orthodontist would not send another warning. And in that moment the fluorescent light above me flickered and steadied, and I took it as a small joke from the universe about resilience that refuses to burn out. On the drive home, I rehearsed everything I would not say when the confrontation inevitably happened, because there is a vanity in speeches that make the speaker feel noble and the listener feel scolded, and I wanted neither. I wanted consequence. I wanted correction. I wanted a reset so sharp it would be felt in the bones, and when I pulled into the driveway the phone rang again with her name, and I finally answered, letting her pour a storm of accusations that included words like theft and betrayal and cruelty, and when she paused for air I told her in a voice as calm as a still lake that I would meet her at the coffee shop near campus in 3 hours, and that she should bring her laptop. And that she should be ready to listen, because I had facts and signatures and more than one surprise. She laughed, a brittle sound that said she expected another lecture, and I let her laugh, because the most efficient revenge is not a speech or a slap back online. It is a truth unveiled in a way that reorganizes the map in someone's head, and as I ended the call I opened my own laptop and queued the documents, the highlighted transfers to the boyfriend's little dream, the late-night deposits from my overtime pay stubs, and the simple, devastating spreadsheet that would show, cell by cell, where the river actually began. The coffee shop was already crowded when I arrived, filled with students in graduation gowns still half unzipped, their families trailing behind with balloons and flowers, and the smell of burnt espresso mingling with the heat of too many conversations happening at once. Yet in the corner near the window sat my daughter, posture stiff, fingers clenched around her phone as though gripping it hard enough might restore the digits missing from her balance. She looked up at me with the kind of glare that children reserve for strangers who have crossed them, and for a flicker of a moment I almost believed she had convinced herself I was the villain she was painting me to be. I crossed the room slowly, deliberately, and when I sat opposite her, I slid the envelope across the table without speaking, letting the weight of paper and ink do what my voice could not. She tore it open with the impatience of someone who had already decided what she would find, and as her eyes darted across the pages line after line of transactions showing deposits from my paychecks, transfers to cover emergencies, payments to the school when scholarships fell short, her face shifted in small betraying movements, disbelief first, then a rising anger that had no place to land. She whispered accusations under her breath, words like manipulation and invasion, until she reached the highlighted section I had marked with fluorescent yellow, where withdrawals lined up with her boyfriend's failed business adventure. The so-called app that was supposed to revolutionize grocery shopping yet drained more money than it ever dreamed of raising. Her lips parted as though she might defend him, but the silence stretched too long, and even she could not conjure a justification strong enough to withstand the neat column of numbers. I told her in one long, steady voice that I had watched her drift further from me with every semester, listened to her echo her father's words about independence and self-made strength, while I quietly funneled the overtime hours of my own body into keeping her dream alive, never once asking for thanks, only asking that she stay afloat. I told her she had believed a lie, that her father's charisma and her boyfriend's promises had built her a version of reality where I was expendable, but the truth had always lived in the bank records, in the bags under my eyes, in the knees that ached from standing too long during double shifts. She said nothing for a long moment, staring out the window as though the world outside could rescue her from the facts printed in front of her. Then she laughed, brittle and defensive, and told me I was cruel to pull the rug out now, that whatever sacrifices I had made were in the past, and that she deserved control over her future without being shackled to what I thought she owed me. I leaned forward and told her plainly that respect cannot grow in soil watered only by entitlement, that she had asked the world to see her as self-made while standing on the scaffolding I had built with my own exhaustion, and that if she wanted the independence she flaunted, she could begin by earning it instead of borrowing it under my name. Her voice rose in protest, attracting the attention of the tables around us, but I did not flinch, because humiliation had already been my companion once, and I was no longer afraid of its sting. When she finally stormed out, leaving the envelope on the table like an unwanted receipt, I gathered it up calmly, placed it back in my bag, and ordered myself another coffee with the kind of deliberate patience that only comes when you know the game has shifted. The calls that followed throughout the evening were louder, angrier, more dramatic, as friends of hers joined the chorus, repeating her version of events without the benefit of the documents that sat folded in my purse. I answered none of them, choosing instead to sit in the quiet of my living room, the envelope still near at hand, knowing that while she raged and painted me as the villain, the truth had already begun its slow, relentless work of unmasking. By the time night fell, another message arrived, this one not from her but from a mutual acquaintance who had seen the boyfriend pack his things and leave town without so much as a word of explanation, the failed dream of his startup trailing behind him like smoke. My daughter's posts online turned sharper, desperate, filled with claims that I had ruined everything, that I had robbed her of her chance, yet the comments beneath them were not as unanimous as she had hoped. Some questioned her entitlement. Some asked why she had never acknowledged where the money truly came from, and some even suggested that the account had been misused long before I touched it. She would not admit it publicly, but I knew she was cornered, her illusions collapsing piece by piece, and I felt no joy in it, only the cold satisfaction of a truth finally given teeth. Still, I knew this was only the first strike, the beginning of a reckoning that had been delayed for too many years, and as I turned off the lamp beside me and let the darkness settle around the house, I understood that the storm was only building. She would not accept defeat quietly, not my daughter, not after a lifetime of being told she was exceptional, and I braced myself for the next wave, for the fallout that would demand something sharper than numbers on paper. The night was silent, but the silence was deceptive, the kind that hums just before thunder breaks the sky. The storm arrived faster than even I had anticipated, not in the form of quiet conversations among relatives or discreet questions from family friends, but as a digital wave of fury that poured itself across social media, where my daughter, with her polished pictures from graduation still fresh and glowing, posted a furious accusation declaring that her own mother had stolen from her, drained her future, and left her humiliated at the very moment she should have been celebrating her triumph. The comments came in floods, first from her classmates who had always seen me as the background figure in her story, the one who dropped her off and picked her up without ever lingering long enough to be noticed, and then from cousins and acquaintances who eagerly joined the chorus, quick to adopt her narrative because outrage travels faster than truth. Within hours, my name had become shorthand for betrayal in her carefully curated circle, and though some of the words stung, most of them rang hollow because I had heard versions of them before in quieter tones, whispered by those who could not imagine that survival sometimes requires choices that don't look heroic on the outside. I sat at my kitchen table as the messages came in, the glow of my phone lighting the darkened room while the rest of the house remained still, and instead of answering I brewed another pot of coffee and let the voices wash over me like static. There is a strange calm that comes when you are finally accused of what you have secretly feared being accused of all along, as though the worst thing has already been spoken aloud and now you can stop hiding from its shadow. Yes, I had taken the account, yes, I had emptied it, and yes, I had left her with a note as sharp as a blade, but what none of them knew, what she herself had refused to acknowledge, was that the balance she believed to be entirely hers was built brick by brick from hours she had never seen me work, sacrifices she had never asked about, and debts I had swallowed quietly so her life could look effortless from the outside. But silence is a dangerous kind of power, and I knew that if I let the narrative stand too long without interference, it would calcify into fact in the eyes of everyone who mattered to her. So I chose my moment carefully, not with a dramatic announcement or a self-defensive tirade, but with a slow leak of information that would force her to face what she had buried. I gathered the copies of the statements I had already shown her, the records of deposits tied directly to my payroll, and I slipped them discreetly to one relative I knew still had a shred of loyalty to truth over performance. It took less than a day for that relative to confirm what I had told her in the coffee shop, and soon the whispers began to turn against her, not in full force yet, but enough to make her uncomfortable. Her boyfriend's disappearance had already cracked her carefully composed image, and when it became clear that large chunks of her so-called education fund had been siphoned into his doomed venture, the sympathy she had counted on began to erode. Friends who had rushed to defend her started asking subtle, but pointed questions in comment threads. Why had she never acknowledged where the money came from? Why had she trusted a man with no track record? Why had she believed she was entirely self-made when the evidence suggested otherwise? She responded with anger, doubling down on her narrative of betrayal, insisting that none of it excused me from what I had done. But the louder she grew, the more defensive she sounded, and the less convincing her story became. I admit there was a part of me that took satisfaction in watching her corner tighten, in seeing her struggle against the consequences of arrogance she had worn so proudly. But there was another part, quieter and heavier, that mourned the distance between us. Because a mother does not stop loving simply because a child wounds her. Still, love is not meant to be confused with permission, and when she crossed another line by threatening to drag the story into legal channels, posting cryptic messages about justice and exposure, I knew it was time to show her that I had more leverage than she realized. At a family dinner the following weekend, where the atmosphere was thick with forced cheer and the undercurrent of whispers that never quite died down, I stood and addressed not the room but her directly, my voice steady and stripped of theatrics. I told her that if she wished to pursue her claims, she should be prepared for every transaction to be examined, every dollar accounted for, and every embarrassing truth about her choices laid bare, including the fact that the money she believed stolen had been mismanaged long before I touched it. She blanched, but tried to hold her posture, only to falter when I added that I had already spoken with the bank and could provide notarized confirmation of every transfer. The silence that followed was the kind that cuts deeper than shouting, a silence where eyes shift and loyalties begin to rearrange themselves. When I sat down again, she excused herself from the table, her face pale and tight, and I heard the front door slam a moment later. Conversations resumed awkwardly, relatives pretending to move on, but the damage had already been done, and she knew it. That night, her posts slowed, her online army thinned, and for the first time in years she found herself without the easy refuge of applause. I did not celebrate, because this was not triumph but war, and wars rarely end with parades. Instead, I went home and poured myself a glass of water, sitting in the quiet with the knowledge that the next confrontation would not come through screens or comments, but face to face, raw and unfiltered, and when it did, I would need to be ready. She came to my door on a Sunday evening when the neighborhood was already folding into the kind of quiet that makes every sound carry, and when I opened it she stood on the porch without makeup and without the armor of friends or a camera pointed at her, holding herself like a person who had been sprinting in place for too long and had suddenly remembered that the ground beneath her was not a treadmill, but a floor that demanded balance, and behind her eyes I saw the rage that had fueled the past few days, warring with an older, smaller fear that I recognized from the first time she wobbled on a bicycle and refused my hand because she wanted to master the pedal without witnesses. She asked to come in with a voice that tried to be firm and could not quite manage it, and I stepped aside and let her pass, watching her pause in the hallway as if the framed photos might accuse her, even though most of them showed a little girl with gap teeth and a mother who stayed slightly out of frame. Because someone had to hold the camera and remember when the light looked best. We sat at the kitchen table where so many budgets had been broken into digestible pieces, and before she could launch into the speech I knew she had practiced in the car, I slid a plain folder across the wood, the same way I had slid an envelope across the coffee shop table, and I told her that while the chorus online had enjoyed its performance, the final act did not belong to them, it belonged to us, and it would be written without an audience. She opened the folder with less bravado than last time, skimming the first page where a neat letter from the bursar confirmed that I had paid the final expenses of her term in full and had also exercised my right, as the primary contributor and guarantor, to convert the remaining balance of her so-called fund into a restricted trust that could not be accessed for rent, vacations, or entrepreneurial fantasies, but could be released in monthly stipends upon proof of employment and a course completion plan that did not include the boyfriend who had already fled the stage, and as she read she gripped the paper so tightly that a crease formed like a fault line down the center. I watched her swallow whatever accusation had been loaded behind her teeth, and I told her in a tone that I kept even and almost conversational that revenge, when done properly, is only a mirror that forces a person to see themselves without the flattering angles, and that what I had done was not about punishment, it was about removing the cushions she had mistaken for a throne. Because there is no lesson in softness if the softness never ends. She began to protest that she could not possibly work and complete the certification she wanted and also manage the practical grind of adult life, and I let her speak every fear aloud. Nodding not because I agreed, but because I remembered that same list marching through my mind for years, and when she ran out of air I slid the second paper forward. A letter from a local firm where a woman I once trained now ran a team and had agreed to offer my daughter an interview for a paid role that would match the stipend and cover what the trust would not, provided she arrived with a portfolio of the work she had actually done and not the work others had tidied for her in the background. She stared at the offer with something like insult and something like hope, and then pushed it away, asking if this was the price of my love, if I would only help her if she performed gratitude on command, and I told her no. That gratitude performed is as useless as a check written in disappearing ink, and that what I wanted was not a kneeling child, but an adult who understood terms, because the world deals in contracts whether you sign them or not. I reached for the final sheet and kept it in my hand for a long second, letting the weight of the choice rise between us like heat from a stove, and then I laid it down. A one-page notarized statement that I had drafted with the language of a door left open rather than a verdict carved in stone. A statement acknowledging that her education had been funded in large part by me, and that she had mismanaged funds in ways that were unwise. A statement she could file privately with the trust administrator to activate the stipend schedule. A statement that would never be posted, never be screenshotted, never be used as a cudgel at Thanksgiving, because the only apology that matters is the one that changes behavior in silence. For a while we listened to the refrigerator hum and the pipes clink and the tiny animal sounds a house makes when it is deciding whether it will shelter you or swallow you, and then she asked, in a voice so small it hurt to hear, whether this was forgiveness. And I told her it was a map, that forgiveness was a town she would have to reach on her own feet, and that I had removed the detours she insisted on taking, but would not carry her the rest of the way, because the part where a person becomes themselves is always a walk nobody else can do for them. Her face changed then, not into gratitude and not into defiance, but into something thoughtful and exhausted, and she gathered the papers slowly, as if afraid they would burn her if she moved too fast, and said she needed time, which was the truest sentence she had spoken all week. She left without slamming the door, and I stood in the entryway after she was gone with my hand on the knob and my ear full of a silence that did not feel like victory but also did not feel like defeat, and when my phone began to ring again, relatives and friends and even the ex-husband lining up to audition for the role of judge and chorus, I let it tremble unanswered on the hall table, because there are endings that deserve witnesses, and there are endings that grow only if you refuse to narrate them, and somewhere out in the evening my daughter sat in her car with a pen uncapped, a signature half-formed, and a future that would either begin with a hard step forward or fold back into the soft chair of blame, and I will not tell you which one she chose. Because the truth is that I do not yet know, and because the most honest revenge is to hand a person the pen and walk away before they decide whose story this becomes.